What's up, everybody? This is Aghastly Statements from Gearworks.com and the E2KG Network podcasting channel and the Rounding Off Infinity gaming channel on YouTube, here with the debut episode of Off His Own Bat, a new weekly comic book podcast here on the E2KG Network. So what am I doing here? Well, the tale of the tape so far is I have been wanting for a very long time to do a comic book podcast and have a conversation on a weekly basis about the comic books that I read. The issue is that I want that podcast to cover a certain breadth, a certain span of material. So I personally read DC and Marvel, but I also read comics from the Tier 3 and Tier 4 publishers like Dark Horse, Image, IDW, Zenescope, 7 Seas, Action Labs, etc., and indie comics from here and there. I generally have about 12 comics that are on my recurring monthly pull list, but I also frequently do drop-ins and just kind of random checkouts of given comics from the different publishers. And I'm looking for somebody who is of similar ilk who wants to also have a weekly conversation about comic books. Actually, it could be another 3 or 4 someone so that we could kind of have a rotation and then nobody would have to be on the show every single week, which is kind of what the Games Crew does on the E2KG network. But I've been wanting to have this conversation and I also really wanted to start converting some of my written material that I do on my blog, Gearworks.com, over to video and audio to help round out some of my content creation activities. So I just wanted to go ahead and get the podcast started as a monologue. So I'm going to riff here for a while. I don't know exactly how long this is going to be. And what I'm hoping is that maybe after a few episodes that somebody else who is also interested in comic books and wants to participate in a weekly conversation or a periodic conversation will see this and then will save me from myself and come here and fill the second seat. Even better if somebody would come, 2 somebodies would come and fill the second and third seat so we could round out this conversation. I'm really looking for to have a very inclusive podcast about comic books. And so, people of color, women, just, again, always looking to fill out with additional co-hosts on the E2KG network, and also especially for this podcast. So the format for this podcast is going to be, each week I'm going to talk about the first 3 comics that I read from my pull list, and I am also going to talk about the best thing that I read the past shipping week, as well as any honorable mentions. So honorable mentions will be on my review scale, which is a 1 to 10 ranking with half-point increments in between, so 5.5, 6, 6.5. Honorable mentions would be any comics that where my review score was an 8.0 or above. I'll also be posting some of this content to the blog, so you'll also be able to find it over there. And then I'm going to round out the monologue with a rundown of what I'm going to be reading the next week, including the 3 books that I'll be talking about on the next episode of Off His Own Bat. So let's get started with the first 3 books that I read from the week shipping. That was, I think, the 12th of September of last week. So the first thing that I read was Newbury and Hobbs, the Undying #1, published by Titan Comics, written by George Mann with artwork by Dan Boltwood. So it's a Victorian-era comic, topically similar to Sherlock Holmes and the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is kind of right in my wheelhouse. I love material from that age. I had high hopes going into this comic, as I really love Victorian-era period pieces. I was a little worried that it might ape Sherlock Holmes a bit too much. The main difference in this comic, though, was that you have Veronica Hobbs instead of Watson, and Veronica Hobbs is obviously a woman. So I was looking to see how that kind of changed the dynamic. In the opening pages, I really like the expository narrative that's done from Veronica's perspective and point of view. And right out of the gate, I also really like that she's engaged in fisticuffs and in the action right alongside Newbury. Now, in the industry right now, I felt, going into this that, man, this comic is a little bit risky. There's room in it in publishing right now. I don't really know that any other publishers are doing something similar. I don't think anybody's covering this sort of material. There's not a ton of Victorian-era comics, although there was a Conan Red Sonja crossover miniseries, I think, earlier this year. Actually, the last issue or 2 of the issues, or those might still be due to come out. And that took place largely in the Victorian era as well. But I felt it was a little bit risky, so I was really interested to see. Titan Comics is really great about kind of squarely picking things that nobody else is really covering at the time and aren't necessarily part of the mainstream, and that's one of the reasons why I love them as a publisher. But I wasn't super crazy about where this book landed with me. The problem with this book is it just didn't hook me with anything unique of its own. There were elements of Sherlock Holmes there, as well as bits and pieces of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but I couldn't really put my finger on anything that made Newbury and Hobbs a new thing in and of itself. There's some elements of the macabre, but nothing super shocking in nature or visually in the artwork. And the places where Hobbs could have made the story take on a kind of a unique tone, didn't feel like they really capitalized on it. Now, Newbury and Hobbs, this is a second or third iteration or volume of these characters. They have been done before. They have some history behind them. I have not onboarded with them before. I wasn't really aware of this comic, so this was my first time going in. So I get and kind of understand stylistically as a writer that maybe you don't make the fact that Hobbs is a woman really a thing, and you just make it like, she's here in this material. It's not a thing to really be pointed out or talked about. But I feel like it's Victorian era England, and if you're not going to speak to it, then kind of why bother? The artwork was fine, nothing particularly captivating in colors or shading. There are a few panels that were really well done in terms of fight choreography, particularly in the opening pages. Really flat color palette, and even though the reds don't pop out, which I kind of would have preferred. It was a little too pastel-y, too watercolory. We'll talk a little bit when we talk about Miss Marvel, how there's some subtle differences in that art approach with also a relatively flat color palette. Overall, too, the pace of the book felt kind of slow. It actually caused me to take dynamically. So I started reading this, and it was a bit of a gristle to kind of chew through. I buy my comics digitally on Wednesday. And I was actually kind of stuck in this issue till like Saturday, really until I got moving about trying to put together the prep material for this podcast. So it was kind of a really slow burn. Like I said, it caused me to take the first 4 days of the reading cycle to read this, and then I kind of had to really turn on the afterburners to get through the rest of my pull list. So it's not bad, but I just felt like it wasn't really for me, at least not right now. So overall, I scored this 7.0 out of 10, which makes it kind of squarely an average to medium book for me. I'm not looking to onboard this or pull this into my list of recurring pulls. It was fine, but just didn't really hook me as something above the norm. So going on to the next comic that was in my read list was Miss Marvel, number 34 by Marvel Comics, written by G. Willow Wilson, art by Nico Leon, colors by Ian Herring, and letters by Joe Caramagna, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So I think we're in about the third or fourth issue of this arc. It's been going on since the conclusion of the Miss Marvel annual, which kind of set a new status quo as far as Kamala revealing her secret identity to her friends, to find out that her friends had already figured that out. Now, I should have said in the opening, and I'm going to add some verbiage in there, but this is a spoiler-ridden show. This is about talking about the comics after you've read them. So if I'm revealing things that you weren't aware of, please go finish your pull list. I do this pretty late in the week, in the shipping week, with shipping being on Wednesday. So I'm doing this on Monday night, in the hopes that everybody has gotten through their stack already. So at any rate, if you read Miss Marvel number 34, then you should know already that she revealed her secret identity to her friends back in Miss Marvel Annual. And of course, when she did, she found out that her friends had already predominantly figured that out, so they didn't really need her to tell them. But from that jumping off point, we got into this arc, which is about her reconciling her relationship with Bruno. After the annual, Bruno showed back up. The two had kind of been a little estranged before, but the two kind of reconnected and set out to start conducting experiments to determine the limits of Kamala's powers. Now, after they started this experimentation where things already started kind of going a little wonky, the Shocker shows up in New Jersey. And in the course of trying to put him down, Kamala saw her powers start to go further or more haywire. And the theory that she and Bruno have been working against is that it's the result of the experimentation that they started. Hold on to that thought. At the end of last issue, Bruno, realizing that he couldn't be of any assistance to Kamala while she was duking out with the Shocker, decided he would go back to the lab and see if he could be of assistance there by determining the cause of Kamala losing full faculty over her powers. So that's the setup. The art here is a step above par, so I really like Leon's art. and really, it's really the work of the team, because what I really like about it is what Herring seems to be able to do with a fairly limited range of colors. It's kind of a brownish, yellowish spectrum color palette. It's fairly flat and a lot of earth tones. It kind of feels like a little bit of watercolor, but it's not quite that as abstract. So it doesn't quite look like the Jessica Jones covers, which again kind of get mimicked on the opening screen of the television show, the Netflix television show. So it's not quite that abstract. The reds and the yellows don't pop here, but they feel like they're a little more punchy because there's a little more contrast. So they're different than the flat color tones and color palettes of Newbury and Hobbes, and they're done in a manner that I much more so prefer. There's sharper contrast, and like I said, a lot of browns and yellows, but then they kind of make the reds, again, they're not punchy, bright reds like you see in something like Champions number 24, which I'm going to talk about near the end of the podcast, but there's just higher contrast, so they stand out more without necessarily being kind of a poppy, overly glossy color set. So it works well. Leon's art style doesn't really appeal to me as much. It's a little too cartoony, but I do you got to give the guy props, because Miss Marvel has a really weird power set with her ability to embiggen, as they call it in the comic. So she has this capability to mutate, and so you can really get some really wacky fight choreography. And I will say, Leon definitely holds that together. It never loses continuity, and it's consistently well done. Where I lose a little bit of traction with this comic is with the repurposing of the Shocker as some kind of like just below the criminal genius level guy. So the reveal in this issue is that Bruno does figure out where Kamala is borrowing mass from, and it's not that her powers are creating it. It's that her powers are taking mass from her own body at different points in the timeline. And so her powers basically find her physical mass at a different point in time and time shift the mass so she can borrow it to get bigger. And I assume that she gives it to one of those other time-separated personas when she's getting smaller. So in the meantime, while all this has been going on, Kamala has also been popping in and out of our timeline and dimension while her powers have been going haywire, and she runs into the character Singularity, which is a time and dimension traveling entity who in this instance guides her back to her own timeline and gives her enough info for her to catch on to what's happening. But then from that point, we get this bit of Shocker dialogue that makes it seem like he actually knows what he's doing, and that he's been causing her her powers to go haywire and causing her to pop in and out of the timeline deliberately. And I'm just a little bit kind of like, really? The Shocker? Come on. So this guy's a slub who's been, at one point, he was scripted to be killed off in the 1985 villain culling, which I think was orchestrated by Mark Grunwald, I'm not positive, by a character called the Scourge, whose gun in that time frame had a kind of unique, I forget what the term is for when they make the sounds in words on a page, but it had this unique thing that was written as Poom Spack. But this guy was going around offing villains, and Shocker was kind of on the slate to go that way, but he was editorially saved in that instance. I do argue that the Shocker should have been offed in 1985 as a mucky muck who would have been fine to go the way of the dodo. The guy's been around too long, and he always loses, and it gets old and kind of tired. So he's just been too much of a muck-up in the Marvel Universe to be taken seriously for me. Like, I can't buy this guy has figured out how to dork with the timeline, and is deliberately monkeying with Miss Marvel's powers. So it's just kind of a little off-brand for him to suddenly pop up and be the scientific time travel wielding genius. I've been giving the series the benefit of the doubt up until now. This is a comic that is in my regular recurring monthly pulls, but this plotline is kind of wearing a little bit thin on me. I did like seeing the possible futures for Miss Marvel in Bruno's test machine. Especially they have one where they show her as being as eventually becoming the president, which I thought was pretty awesome. But I just feel like we really don't need another time travel centric hero in a comic book. This in my mind, is kind of when the X-Men started kind of falling apart in the mid to late 80s, when everything suddenly became about time travel and multiple versions of themselves. So it's just not necessary. And we have this going on in the CW, and it's become a trope and problematic there. So I really hope that they put this Tempest back in the box. I don't feel that Miss Marvel needs to be fully street grounded, like in the kind of Marvel Knight motif. But I don't know that I need her time traveling, or maybe even worse, going cosmic, which is kind of another place that it seems like characters go once Marvel pulls them into this time travel fabric. I mentioned in my last review, which was actually a written review of Miss Marvel number 33, that I like this book most when Kamala Khan is surrounded by a larger cast of characters to bounce off of. Like, I kind of like her with her group of female friends, and there's this big group dynamic and this exposition on how each of them is really different and unique. I don't so much like the quiet moments in the one-on-one with her and one other supporting character, and I'm kind of not fully interested in this thread with her and the boy issues kind of stuff. We're gonna get into that with her as a character and as she grows up. I'm not super crazy about it at this point in this arc, in this ongoing. So I'd kind of like us to wrap this arc up and move on. So I scored this one a 6.5 out of 10. I kind of feel like it's been heading downhill. I think the last issue I scored a 7.0. This is down to a 6.5. And if it continues in this vein, I just worry that it's going to get worse. Third comic book I read last week was Suicide Squad, number 46 by DC Comics. Story by Rob Williams, who has been off and on Suicide Squad for a very long time, and Dan Abnett. The script was by Rob Williams, pencils by Jose Luis, inks by Jordi Tarragona, colors by Adriano Lucas, and letters by the great Pat Brousseau. I think Pat Brousseau has been doing letters in comics since the 80s. Guy's been around quite a while. The talent list is so long in this particular issue because there's an ongoing crossover between the Suicide Squad and Aquaman. So you get some additional names on here with Abnett working with Williams on the story, and then Williams actually writing the script. And of course, Abnett heads up the creative team over on Aquaman. So I've been talking for quite a while straight, so please allow me to get a hit of Moju's here. Gotta love that. So I read the preceding issue of Aquaman, so I was pretty lucky. Again, these were random drop-ins for me, so there's nothing that kind of sets this up for me. It just happened that they both came out of the randomizer. So I was lucky that these two came up in my poll from the list of random drop-ins that I do. I'm not reading these ongoings. Like I said in my recurring poll, Rob Williams has been on Suicide Squad, as I mentioned, off and on, but for a long time. I know he did a bunch of the New 52 arc, and he especially was on the last run that this was part of my recurring poll, as kind of the New 52 was wrapping up before the cut over to Rebirth. So the setup here is that Atlantis has recently ascended to the surface of the Atlantic and now sits just off the coast of, I think it's New York, which is kind of funny because in this whole thing of kind of how Marvel and DC kind of parrot each other periodically, I think it's relatively kind of in the same position that Attilan is in over in the Marvel Universe. I think that's right, as far as I can tell. But ostensibly the status quo between Atlantis and the U.S. is that they are at peace, but a rogue general has coerced Amanda Waller to send the Suicide Squad with a bomb that, as far as the squad understands, is designed to send Atlantis back to the ocean floor, but in reality is actually a nuke designed to destroy Atlantis entirely. So in the last pages of Aquaman, the team came to this realization and fractured between those who wanted to go through with it and those who were morally opposed, moral opposition on the Suicide Squad. It's an interesting take because the squad is largely amoral. So at the end of that book, and in the opening of this book, you have Deadshot and Harley Quinn captured by Arthur, while Satanus, who has recently been recruited to the Suicide Squad, has kind of assumed leadership of the squad and has grabbed Killer Croc, Master Jailer, and a traitor from Atlantis named Ursel, while Arthur heads for the bad part of town in Atlantis to recruit help from King Shark. Things are starting to get interesting. So this is a bang-out big battle action comic. It's exactly the kind of stuff that fans of capes and tight stuff kind of want every issue, and it works. In between some of the action sequences, we get a lot of maudlin from Master Jailer, which seems a bit quirky. given that he's a pretty underused and not well-known character in the DC universe from my perspective. And it's like every other panel, he's really overwrought about the ethics of this issue. And I'm kind of like, I don't really know who cares about Master Jailer's opinion on whether they should use the nuke or not. Maybe if another character were voicing that. It just seemed kind of weird. Seems like he's not relevant enough to really carry that torch and wave that flag. So it seems strange that he has so many panels agonizing over it. That being said, it kind of needs to be done from a story perspective. So I guess he's just as fine as anyone else doing it. Who knows? What's really impressive here is the handle Rob Williams has on all these Atlantis characters, which he doesn't usually write. It's pretty pitch perfect, and even some of the character nuance things like Merc torturing Harley to get information out of her. And then there's a point in the comic where Satanus erects a barrier between himself, between what I call the alt-suicide squad and the Atlanteans who are coming to try and stop him, and Dolphin is stuck inside of that barrier, so she's not cut off, but she's now cut off from the rest of her teammates. I think I'm not super familiar with some of these Atlantean characters, but I think Dolphin is mute, and so she takes off. Now there's a point in the comic too where Satanus kills Ursel. It's a very shocking big splash page, kind of really catches you off guard. So right after that, he puts up this barrier and Dolphin's inside of it. She's not the most powerful character in the DC universe, so I think she knows that this is probably a suicide mission for her to try and go and stop him. There's this touching moment between her and Arthur on the other side of the barrier, and the really funny thing is that he has Harley, who we often forget actually has a degree and is a practiced psychiatrist or psychologist, conveying to Arthur what Dolphin is feeling. So it's really kind of a touching moment in the comic. So another mark that's equally evident is on the art side. So let me just say, big friggin' tip of the hat to Jose Luis, and really the whole art team as well. It's a big assignment in an issue like this that happens entirely underwater for a team that doesn't normally handle this material and predominantly does land-based locales in the ongoing Suicide Squad. And as far as I can tell, the art doesn't skip a beat. Heck, this would be regarded as an excellently drawn issue of Aquaman if it was on the regular ongoing. There's tons of detail dripping everywhere, no pun intended, including the hard shell formations on Merc's left shoulder, Mira's flowing hair. When you kind of look at it, you can see how it pops and jostles around when she's angry or like angrily walking through the halls of Atlantis in the parts that are dry, versus like sitting on her throne and talking calmly to somebody. You can see that in the facial work of Harley's emotes, and that's one thing that a lot of artists don't do. They don't really have Harley Quinn emote facially that much because she's crazy. But they do put that in here, and it's a nice touch of flair. And then you can see the Atlanteans' oxygen scrubbing bubbles as they exhale underwater. So, I mean, it's really just kind of artwork that's worthy of gushing over. Very nice panel work, which keeps the views fresh without becoming gaudy. Some alternate designs versus just a strict, 4:9 box layout. On top of all that, just great underwater monster and creature work. Lewis just does a great job of, again, drawing things that artists on his particular ongoing genre may not normally draw, kind of a little BPRD Hellboy-like, just in terms of the creature content that he had to take on for this issue. And then you have this big guard dog analog outside the Silent School, which is where the Atlanteans store all of their Atlantean magic artifacts. By the way, I might mention, for people from Atlantis, if you own a lot of magic stuff, that would be a particular interest to criminals, maybe you don't centrally locate all of it in one place. So, at any rate, just great artwork overall by Lewis and the art team on this issue. It's all rounded out by a well-timed and well-scripted splash page when, like I said, Satanus impales Ursel, as well as another one when Aquaman and the King Shark gang show up. Big portrait, full-page panel, so it looked really good. So I mentioned the thing about Harley. So all in all, this gets back to the feel that I had of the book when Williams was doing his closing run on the New 52 variant of the Suicide Squad. And really, so Suicide Squad, like I said, is not one of my recurring pulls. If I had room on my pull list, I think this issue would have made me on board with it. It didn't tick up into the honorable mention space of an 8.0 or above. I think I rated this. No, I did. It is an 8.0. So if I had room to put it on my pull list, I would. Right now, I'm waiting on Buffy season 12, The Reckoning to drop off, and eventually also Titan Comics' Millennium, which are currently occupying 2 spots on my pull list right now, but are limited series, so they'll eventually drop off. So at that point, I might go grab Suicide Squad and put it on. But right now, I just don't have room for it. Again, forgive my mistake, I did rate this issue an 8.0 out of 10. The best thing I read this week was Champions, number 24 by Marvel Comics. Written by Jim Zub, art by Sean Isaacs, colors by Marcio Menez and Eric Arciniega. Letters by Clayton Cowles. It's the most, in my mind, it's the most significant issue. It's the most significant comic book shipped last week for the issue that it covers. It deals with a shooting at the school that Miles Morales attends, the high school. The book opens up with the Champions helping out at a construction site, helping out a charity. Miles receives an emergency broadcast signal on his phone. I'm sure everybody's gotten those things, like when you get an Amber Alert or a tornado warning. It's the beginning of the school year right now, and some of the Champions are not yet in school because their classes don't start for another couple of weeks. Miles' school has actually started, but on that particular day, they're selecting electives and doing scheduling, and he's already selected all of his courses for the upcoming semester, so he's been allowed to play hooky. So he gets the emergency alert, rapidly transits across New York, gets to school to find out that one of his friends has been shot, and the issue goes on with a lot of silent panels, and it's really all about how Miles and the Champions come to terms with the notion that they can't save everyone, which is a typical thing that we see superheroes go through, but it's particularly poignant with these characters who are supposed to be high schoolers and are kind of coming of age and coming into their own as I would call them the heir apparents to the Avengers at some point. It's a really powerful issue. It's a bit tear-inducing for me, and I'm sure a lot of others, particularly as parents with the high frequency with which shootings happen in schools these days. There are days and times that it actually psychologically cripples me to send my kids off to school. Some mornings and have to consider the possibility that they may not come home, which is crazy, right? I served in the military. My mom mentioned some of those same concerns, but I was going off to do a certain particular thing, right? The notion that today parents suffer those same feelings, just sending their kids to school to get an education, which is a requirement in this country, is absolutely appalling and unsatisfactory. Best thing in this issue is we get one of the best scenes ever between Miles Morales and Kamala Khan. And I actually think we go back to my comments about Miss Marvel number 34. And unfortunately, I kind of feel like maybe Champions is the best Miss Marvel comic being written right now. When I tweeted out about the best thing that I read this week for my Twitter account, one of the things I mentioned to Zub and Isaacs, I don't know if they have any influence on this happening or not at Marvel, but I'm like, hey, can we just go ahead and get a Kamala Khan, Miles Morales miniseries? Like, I really like to see a limited series just featuring those two characters. I'm kind of thinking of like the Nightcrawler miniseries from the mid '80s, where Nightcrawler and Kitty Pryde and his dragon, I can't remember the dragon's name, when they were pulled off to an alternate dimension. And I'd kind of like to see that, to just isolate those two characters away from the Marvel Universe for a while. I also think it would be really neat to see the Champions kind of without those two very strong personalities for 4 issues or so, and just kind of see how that changes the group dynamic. The Champions is not part of my recurring pulls, but I really like what's going on in the series. I love that Amadeus Cho has taken on the hero named Brawn and is no longer kind of labeling and branding himself as the Hulk. So overall, the issue was just awesome. I I rated it a 9.0 out of 10. And I feel like, it's worth a read. So go check that out. Honorable mentions this week, other comics that I would have rated an 8.0 or above. As I mentioned, Suicide Squad number 46 by Rob Williams. Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man number 309 by Chip Zdarsky with art by Chris, I don't know if it's Bacalo or Bacalo. And Fantastic Four number 2 by Dan Slott with art by Sarah Pacelli, which just has an absolutely awesome ending page. So if you haven't checked out Fantastic Four with their return, maybe, I know Dan Slott definitely has people who don't like him, and that's a shame, because it's just a great issue, and I love the reveal at the end. Next week, so on next week's pull list, I am going to be reading the following comics. Batman number 55, Buffy the Vampire Slayer Season 12, The Reckoning number 4, which is the conclusion of that limited series. Theoretically, this is the last Buffy comic that is going to be written. Her story will end at this point. I will say it's definitely supposed to be the last one that Joss Whedon works on. Now, with the reboot of the series that happens, who knows what might happen with her in comics after that. But I think Joss Whedon is looking to close this chapter on this character, or really close her story for good. I'll also be reading Immortal Hulk number 6, Justice League number 8, Millennium, the Girl Who Danced with Death number 2. And if you're not familiar with that series, this is a comic book version of the second set of stories that stem from the Millennium series, which started with the girl with the dragon tattoo. So Titan Comics is publishing that. I'll also be reading Star Wars number 54, and I'm going to try and get through. I have a compendium, I guess, a larger volume trade of the Defenders, again from the 80s, the Defenders Volume 8. Excuse me, I'm going to try and get through another 6 issues of that next week. I'm trying to power through that. It's like 14 or 15 issues, so it's bigger than a normal trade. Just dropped last month, and I'm trying to get through that so I can do a review of that. So next week, what I'm going to talk about on the show is, out of those, I'm going to talk about Batman number 55, Star Wars number 54, and as I mentioned, Millennium, the Girl Who Danced with Death number 2. Those are going to be the 3 that I specifically write up review notes on, and that I will cover in detail on next week's episode of Off His Own Bat. And then, of course, from there, who knows what the best thing that I read that week will be for next week, as well as honorable mentions. The cards will fall where they may. So look, if you listen to this, and this is a conversation that you really want to be in on, because, again, you read comics from Marvel and DC, and Dark Horse and Image, or Zenoscope, or Seven Seas, or Action Labs, or, comics from other publishers other than just the big 2, maybe some indies as well. Feel free to drop comments in here on the YouTube video if I have comments enabled. Half the time I don't. If I don't have comments enabled, just hit me up on Twitter. I will have my Twitter handle in there. And there's a 90% chance that you found the video on YouTube by seeing my tweet linking to this in the first place. So if this is a conversation that you would like to be in on, if you think you can help out, if you want to give a voice to highlighting the things that you love in comics, the creators that you love, and things that you're not so crazy about, and periodically here I will also cover kind of what the state of the union as far as what's going on at DC and Marvel, and whether or not they're heading in a direction that I like. For years, I didn't like where DC and Marvel were going, but I think they're both kind of on an upswing now, trying to get back to some more positive themes. So, and there'll probably periodically be social issues that come up as well. So look, once again, my name has been Agasically Stamus from GearWorks.com, the E2KG Network podcasting channel, and the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. That's going to do it for this episode of Off His Own Bat here on the E2KG Network. Please check in next week when I'm going to do the same thing all over again. And then check out our other podcasts on the network that cover games and entertainment. Jonathan Reyes, Peter Morrow, and I just did the first episode of It's Another Thing Movies, where we talked about the Netflix original movie Next Gen and did a podcast review of that movie as well. And then catch up with the Games Crew every week as we do E2KG Deep Dive and Enough to Keep Going. Thanks so much for joining in. If you have any comments or other things that you would like me to cover, other comics that you'd like me to read, as I mentioned, drop a comment here on YouTube or hit me up on Twitter. Thanks very much. I will talk to you guys next week. I'm out.